I never meant to open that old chest. It had sat at the foot of my bed for almost 30 years, collecting dust and silence. The kind of silence that hums in an empty house, soft, patient, waiting for someone foolish enough to disturb it. That morning, the rain hadn't stopped since dawn. The roof creaked like it was sighing under the weight of old memories, and the smell of wet earth crept through the window. I made myself a cup of tea, though the cup felt too heavy in my hands. My knees ached, as they always did on cold days, and I told myself I'd just tidy up a little, maybe sort through the chest before my granddaughter's next visit. But deep down, I think I knew. Some part of me knew that chest wasn't just holding fabric and forgotten things, it was holding her. When I lifted the lid, the hinges groaned like they were warning me. Inside, everything was just as I'd left it. Old linens, a photograph of my mother at her wedding, her favorite blue shawl still carrying the faintest trace of her perfume. And then, folded neatly at the very bottom, was the quilt. That quilt. Oh, I hadn't seen it since the week she died. It was her pride and joy, that one. A patchwork of scraps she'd collected over years, bits of old dresses, curtains, and even a corner of my father's old handkerchief. She called it the story blanket because every piece held a memory. I used to sit beside her when I was little, watching her hands move like they were dancing with the needle. She'd hum softly, some tune I never quite learned, and tell me that when she was gone, the quilt would keep her stories safe. I didn't understand what she meant back then. But now, as I touched the fabric, I could almost feel her heartbeat beneath my fingertips. I pulled it out gently and spread it over my lap. The colors were faded, but the stitches were strong. She'd always been precise, my mother, every seam straight, every corner firm. She said a woman's strength was shown in the things she mended quietly, not in what she showed the world. As I traced the patterns, my eyes landed on something strange. In the far corner, where two squares of fabric met a piece of her wedding dress and a piece of my father's shirt, there was a rough patch, unlike her careful work. The thread there was darker, thicker, almost clumsy. For a woman like her, that was unusual. Curiosity pulled at me. I slipped a fingernail under the seam and felt something stiff beneath it. My breath caught. It wasn't fabric. It was paper. I froze. My hands trembled so badly I nearly tore it apart. The paper felt fragile, almost ready to crumble, but I could see the faint outline of handwriting, my mother's. I'd know her pen strokes anywhere. She always wrote like she was afraid to take up too much space on the page. For a long moment, I just sat there, holding that quilt, my heart thudding like it wanted to climb out of my chest. I told myself to stop, to fold it back up, close the chest, and never speak of it again. But there are some silences that demand to be broken. I reached for the small scissors on my bedside table and snipped the seam. Carefully, painfully, I pulled out a folded envelope, yellowed with age. The name on the front was smeared, but I could still read it. For my daughter, when the time is right. My breath hitched. For me. It was meant for me. A wave of emotion hit so hard I had to steady myself against the bed. Why had she hidden it? Why not just give it to me when she was alive? What time had she been waiting for? I turned the envelope over in my hands, feeling the soft crumble of paper under my fingers. My throat burned. I wanted to open it right then and there, but something inside me said, not yet. Because once I read it, I knew there'd be no going back. I leaned back in my chair, clutching the letter to my chest, and let my eyes wander around the room. Everything here was hers, in one way or another. The china cabinet she'd saved up for, the lace curtains she'd sewn herself, even the faint scent of lavender that seemed to cling to the walls. She had been gone for nearly 3 decades. And yet, somehow, she was still here woven into every corner of my life. And for the first time, I realized something. I had spent all those years remembering her as gentle, kind, quiet. But not once had I ever thought of her as mysterious. My mother had been a simple woman, or so I believed. But the letter in my hand told another story. As I stared at it, I remembered small moments I'd long forgotten, things that suddenly didn't seem so ordinary. The nights she stayed up late, sewing long after everyone else was asleep. The times she'd pause mid-song when she thought no one was watching. The soft arguments between her and my father that would end abruptly the moment I walked in. And that one night, the night I'd heard her crying in the kitchen, whispering someone's name I didn't recognize. I'd been 16 then. I had tiptoed back to my room, pretending I hadn't heard. She had come to my bed later, stroked my hair, and told me she loved me more than her own breath. I never asked why she was crying. I thought love was enough. Now I wasn't so sure. The letter felt heavier than paper should. I placed it on the table beside me and looked down at the quilt again. That patch to life sewn together, her wedding dress, and his shirt felt symbolic now. Too symbolic. My father had died young, before I ever really knew the man behind the smile. My mother never remarried, never even spoke his name much after he was gone. But sometimes, when she thought I wasn't looking, she'd stare at his photograph with an expression that wasn't grief exactly, more like guilt. What could she possibly have written after all these years? What truth had she buried so deep she had to stitch it into silence? The rain outside grew heavier, slapping against the windows like an impatient hand. The house groaned under the weight of wind and memory. I could feel the years pressing down on me, urging me to do what I'd avoided my entire life: face the truth. I reached for the letter again. My fingers were shaking so badly that I tore a corner of the paper. Inside, I could see more handwriting, dense, small, hurried. And just as I was about to open it, I heard the floorboard creak. For a second, my heart stopped. The sound came from the hallway, soft, deliberate, like someone had just taken a step. But I lived alone. I turned my head toward the doorway, my breath caught in my throat. The air seemed to thicken, the shadows stretching long across the floor. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. No answer, just the old house settling. Perhaps, but in that moment, it felt like the past itself had woken up. I looked down at the letter again. Its edges fluttered in the draft from the window. And then, something strange happened. I caught a faint scent: jasmine and wood smoke. My mother's scent. The same one that used to cling to her shawl after she'd spent the evening by the fire. Tears filled my eyes before I even realized I was crying. "Mama," I breathed, my voice breaking. Was she here? Was this her way of telling me the time was right now? The letter trembled in my hands. I pressed it against my heart, whispering a silent prayer I hadn't spoken in years. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky, echoing like footsteps through time. The light flickered once, then steadied. And in that trembling stillness, I finally unfolded the paper. Whatever truth my mother had hidden beneath that quilt had waited decades to be found. And now, ready or not, I was about to learn it. They say a house remembers the people who loved it, even after all these years. When I close my eyes, I can still hear the old wooden gate creak open, smell the rose oil Mama used to rub into the window frames, and hear the faint ticking of the clock above the fireplace that never seemed to stop no matter what life threw our way. That little house sat at the edge of a sleepy village, surrounded by apricot trees and the gentle hum of the fields. The walls were whitewashed every spring, and Mama would hang a wreath of dried lavender above the door. "A home should smell like love," she used to say, brushing a strand of hair from her face. her hands always busy with something kneading dough, mending a shirt, or tending to her garden that never failed to bloom. I was just a child then, all knees and curiosity. I thought the world began and ended within our fence. My father, tall and soft-spoken, would come home from the fields with his boots caked in mud and a quiet smile on his face. Mama would scold him gently for leaving footprints across her clean floor, but she'd already have his tea poured, and her laughter would follow her words like a melody. Those evenings were my heaven. We'd sit around the dinner table as the sun melted into the horizon. Mama's cooking filled the air with smells that made you feel safe. Spiced lentils, roasted bread, sometimes sweet pudding if she was in a good mood. She'd hum softly as she served us, and Father would tell stories of his day, how the wind nearly stole his hat, or how the neighbor's cow broke into the vegetable patch again. I would laugh so hard my sides ached, and Mama would shake her head with that secret smile that said she wouldn't trade any of it for the world. Our house was small, but it was full of presents. Every corner had her touch. The embroidered curtains, the polished brass lamp, the jars of pickles lined perfectly on the shelf. She was a woman who believed in order, not because she feared chaos, but because she thought beauty lived in small acts of care. Sometimes I'd wake in the middle of the night and see her still awake, sewing by the faint glow of a lantern. "Go back to sleep, my little bird," she'd whisper. "Dreams don't wait for tired eyes." But even then, there was something in her eyes I didn't understand. A faraway look, soft but heavy. I'd see it most when she thought no one was watching, like she was listening to some old memory whispering her name. She loved the mornings most. She'd open every window wide and let the light pour in like a blessing. She said sunlight kept a house honest. No darkness can live where the light is welcome. She'd often tell me, it was a simple life, and for the longest time, I believed it would stay that way forever. Mama taught me everything I know about tending a home. She taught me how to knead bread with patience, how to scrub a floor until it shone, and how to make a room smell alive with nothing more than lemon peels and a prayer. But more than that, she taught me about love, the quiet kind that doesn't need to be spoken every day. Once, when I was 9, I asked her why she never wore her wedding ring. She paused, then smiled faintly and said, "Some promises don't need gold to hold them together." At the time, I thought it was beautiful. Only later did I realize how many kinds of promises a woman carries, some too heavy to wear on her hand. She and Father were gentle with each other, but not overly affectionate. There was a kind of respect between them that looked calm from the outside. Yet sometimes I'd catch a shadow pass between them, like a cloud dimming the sun for just a second. They never argued in front of me. But I remember nights when their whispers drifted through the thin walls, their tones low and tight, as if words themselves could bruise. Still, every morning, Mama would serve breakfast like nothing had happened. She never let her pain stain the day. She believed women were the keepers of peace. Even when it hurt. When Father fell ill, our home changed quietly. Like a slow season you don't notice until the trees are bare. He spent more time in bed, coughing into a handkerchief that grew paler each week. Mama never left his side. She read to him, fed him soup, and sang softly when he couldn't sleep. I used to sit by the door and watch them, her hand on his, her lips trembling as she whispered something I couldn't hear. He died on a winter evening when the firewood was low and the sky looked like broken glass. I remember the silence after, how it pressed against the walls until I couldn't breathe. Mama didn't cry at the funeral. Not once. She stood straight, her shawl pulled tighter on her shoulders, her face pale but steady. I remember thinking she looked like stone, beautiful, but unyielding. That night, When everyone else had gone, she sat by the fire with father's old photograph in her lap. I crept close, hoping she'd speak, but she didn't. She just stared at it, her thumb brushing the edge of his face over and over, like she was trying to erase something only she could see. Then she said something I'll never forget. "Grief is a guest, my girl. Don't let it unpack." I didn't understand her then. But years later, when I found myself sitting in the same chair after losing the man I loved, I finally did. After father's death, she poured her heart into the house even more. She repainted the walls herself, repaired the fence, and stitched new curtains from old cloth. "If I stop, I'll crumble," she told me once, half laughing. And I don't much like the sound of breaking. But even as she worked, something in her dimmed. I'd find her sometimes staring out the window toward the road that led out of the village. Once, I asked what she was looking for. She smiled softly and said, "Nothing, my little bird. Just the wind." But I noticed things she didn't think I saw. Letters that arrived when I was at school, written on thick paper with no return address. She always hid them quickly, tucking them into her apron or beneath the quilt. When I asked who they were from, she'd brush my hair aside and change the subject, and the way she'd flinch at certain names. I still remember the way she froze when our neighbor mentioned a man named Samuel, a name I'd never heard before. She went pale, her hand gripping the teacup so tightly it almost broke. "I don't know him," she said quickly, but her voice trembled. And that was the first time I knew my mother could lie. Still, life went on. Seasons came and went. I grew taller, older, and our house stayed constant. A keeper of laughter, sorrow, and unspoken things. When I turned 17, Mama gifted me that quilt. "This will keep you warm when I'm gone," she said softly, pressing it into my hands. "And when you look at it, remember all love comes with a little stitching." I didn't understand the weight of those words then. I just hugged her and promised to take care of it. That night, I spread the quilt over my bed and ran my fingers across its patches, the faded reds, the soft blues, the tiny embroidered heart near the corner. I felt safe, wrapped in her world of fabric and secrets. But later that same night, I woke to the sound of her crying again. She was in the kitchen, whispering that same name, Samuel. Her voice broke when she said it. The next morning, she acted as if nothing had happened. She made breakfast, sang an old tune, and smiled at me like everything was perfectly fine. But something inside me shifted that day. The world didn't feel as safe anymore. The walls of that house began to feel thinner. The quiet grew louder. And though I didn't know it then, that was the beginning of the unraveling, the first loose thread in the life we'd sew. Carefully sewn together, they say a house holds its secrets until someone dares to listen. Ours had been whispering for years. I just wasn't ready to hear it. It started so quietly that I almost missed it. At first, it was just little things, tiny shifts that only someone who lived beside my mother every day could notice. A longer pause before she spoke. A faraway look when she thought I wasn't watching. The way her hands trembled just slightly when she poured her morning tea. Our home, once so full of warmth and chatter, began to feel different. Not empty exactly, but watchful. Like even the walls had started keeping secrets. I was 19 then, full of restless hope and still too innocent to believe that love could hide anything dark. I thought Mama was simply getting older, that time had softened her laughter. But then the letters began. They always came on Wednesdays. The postman, old Mr. Harris, would stroll up the path whistling the same tune every week. Usually, I'd fetch the letters before Mama did. But on Wednesdays, she'd be waiting by the door, pretending to dust or rearrange the flower vase, her eyes flicking toward the gate long before he appeared. The first time I noticed, I didn't think much of it. The second time, I saw how quickly she slipped the envelope into her apron pocket before I could glimpse the handwriting dot. By the third time, I knew something was wrong. One afternoon, curiosity got the better of me. I was sweeping the porch when I saw the postman hand her a letter. Her face changed, not in fear, but something close to sorrow mixed with longing. A strange tenderness I hadn't seen in her since my father passed. When she turned to go inside, she nearly bumped into me. For a split second, she froze. Her hand instinctively pressed the letter closer to her chest, and then she smiled. "Just the usual bills," she said too quickly. I nodded, but inside my heart was already stirring with questions. That night, I heard her moving about long after I went to bed. Our floors were old and spoke easily. I crept to my door and peeked through the small crack of light spilling from the kitchen. Mama was sitting at the table, still in her nightgown, the letter unfolded in front of her. Her hands covered her mouth, shoulders trembling. I couldn't tell if she was crying or praying or maybe both. After a long while, she took the letter and walked to her sewing basket. She opened the bottom drawer, slipped it inside, and locked it. Then she stood there, staring at it like it held a part of her soul she couldn't bear to lose. When she turned off the light, I tiptoed back to my room, my heart hammering. I wanted to believe it was nothing, just some forgotten relative. Maybe a debt collector, but deep down, I knew better. Over the next few months, Mama changed in ways that frightened me. She stopped singing. That was the first thing I noticed. The woman who used to hum through her chores, who filled every silence with some tune from her youth, now worked in complete quiet. Even the rhythm of her footsteps seemed heavier. Sometimes, she'd stand by the window for hours, staring toward the road that disappeared behind the hills. The same road Father used to walk home on. The same one she'd told me to stay away from. She began locking doors. Her sewing drawer, the old trunk beneath her bed, even the cabinet where she kept our family photographs. When I asked why, she said, "Mice, my dear. We can't be too careful." But there were no mice in our house. Only memories that wouldn't sit still. One evening, I came home early from the market. The air was heavy with the smell of rain, and I could hear her voice through the kitchen window. At first, I thought she was talking to herself. But then I heard another voice, low, muffled. A man's. I froze. The sound sent a shock through me. No one ever visited us anymore, not since Father's death. Mama had grown private, polite, but distant with neighbors. So, who could it be? I crept to the side of the window and peered through the lace curtain. Mama stood by the stove, her back to me. Across from her was a man, tall, wearing a dark coat and a hat pulled low. I couldn't see his face clearly, only the way he leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if the words between them were too heavy to carry. "I can't," Mama whispered. Her voice trembled. "Not after all this time." The man said something I couldn't hear. She shook her head. "It's too late, Samuel?" That name again. I gasped without meaning to. My hand brushed the window pane, and the curtain moved. Both of them turned. For a moment, my heart stopped. I ducked down, pressing my back to the wall. I heard the sound of the chair scraping, then footsteps. The door creaked open. "Who's there?" Mama's voice came, sharp as I'd never heard it before. I didn't answer. My breath came in shallow bursts. Rain began to fall, masking the sound of my heartbeat. After a few seconds, she shut the door again. I heard her whisper, "She's just a child. She doesn't know." Then silence stopped by the time I gathered the courage to peek again. The man was gone. The only proof he'd been there was an untouched cup of tea cooling on the table and the look on Mama's face. a mix of grief and relief, like she'd just buried something all over again. That night, she didn't come to my room to say goodnight. When I saw her the next morning, her eyes were red and swollen, but her voice was calm, even tender. "Don't forget to wear your shawl, my little bird," she said, brushing dust off my shoulder. "It might rain again." I wanted to ask about Samuel, about the man, the letter, the tears. But something in her tone stopped me. There was a fragility there, a thin wall I didn't dare push against. I told myself I would ask later, when the time felt right. But later never came. A week passed before the next letter arrived. This time, I was the one waiting by the door. When Mr. Harris handed it over, I thanked him, and for a brief second, I hesitated. The envelope was cream-colored, sealed with a faint red wax mark shaped like a rose. There was no return address. I turned it over, pretending to admire the handwriting, then quickly slipped it into my apron. I wanted to see what was inside before Mama did. But before I could even step away, she appeared. "I'll take that," she said softly. Though her eyes were anything but soft, I handed it to her, guilt burning my cheeks. She held my gaze for a long moment before sighing. "Curiosity is a sweet poison, my dear," she murmured, then walked away. That night, I dreamed of letters turning into ashes, of hands sewing secrets into cloth. When I woke, I found her already in the garden, trimming the rose bushes in silence. The air between us changed after that dot. We still shared meals, still went to church together, still laughed sometimes, but the laughter was hollow, rehearsed. There were things neither of us said anymore. The house, once alive with comfort, felt like it had grown another room I couldn't see, where her thoughts lived without me. Sometimes I'd catch her writing late into the night, candlelight flickering against her face. When she noticed me watching, she'd quickly cover the paper. "Just my recipes," she'd say with a strained smile. But no recipe needs tears. Then came the night of the argument. I had gone to bed early, exhausted from helping Mrs. Dale in the field. The rain was fierce that evening, drumming against the roof like a warning. I must have been half asleep when I heard her voice, angry, trembling, unlike anything I'd ever heard from her. "You shouldn't have come back," she said. Then a man's voice, Samuel's. "You can't keep the truth buried forever." "Margaret." I sat up in bed, heart pounding. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the hall. I ran to the door, but didn't open it. I couldn't. I just stood there, listening. "You promised me," Mama cried. "You said you'd let her live in peace." "I kept that promise for 20 years, he shouted. "But she deserves to know." There was silence, then a heavy, endless kind of silence that felt like the world had stopped breathing. When I finally stepped out, the kitchen was empty. The door stood open, the wind howling through it. On the floor, I saw the letter torn, trampled, soaked with rain. Mama was standing in the garden, her hands covering her face. When she saw me, she didn't speak. She just whispered, "Go back to bed," and for the first time, I didn't obey her. I wanted to ask who Samuel was. I wanted to know what promise she'd made, what truth I was too young to carry. But the look in her eyes stopped me. It wasn't anger. It was fear, deep, hollow fear. That night, I lay awake until dawn, listening to the wind move through the trees, wondering what ghosts it carried. The next morning, Samuel was gone again. No trace of him except muddy footprints leading away from the house. Mama never mentioned him after that. She just folded the quilt, placed it neatly at the foot of her bed, and said, almost to herself, "Some things are better left stitched closed." But I couldn't forget. From that day on, every time I looked at that quilt, I felt the weight of what she'd hidden beneath it, the whispers behind closed doors, the letters no one was supposed to read, and the name that haunted her every breath. I didn't know it then. But that secret, the one she'd spent her life protecting, was about to become mine to uncover. And once I did, nothing in that quiet little house would ever be the same again. There are nights that stay stitched to your memory, no matter how many years pass. For me, it was the night I heard my mother's truth. The night that tore through the soft fabric of everything I believed about love, loyalty, and family. It had been raining all week. The kind of relentless, cold rain that made the earth smell heavy and old. The house felt colder, too. My mother's health had worsened. She was often too weak to leave her bed for long. Yet, I could tell her mind was restless. She'd stare out the window for hours, clutching that same faded quilt to her chest, as if it could hold her together. My father had grown quiet as well. He moved through the house like a ghost, polite, careful, distant. He spoke to my mother, but not with her. Their conversations were short, fragile things. Sometimes I'd catch him watching her when she wasn't looking, his eyes filled with something that looked too close to regret. Other times, I'd hear him in the shed late into the night, working on nothing at all, just hammering to fill the silence. I should have known something was coming. The air in the house had that strange stillness, the kind that comes before a storm breaks. That evening, I couldn't sleep. The rain had turned to wind, whispering through the cracks of my window frame. I got up to make myself tea, careful not to wake anyone. The hall was dark, lit only by the flicker of a dying candle. As I passed my parents' room, I heard voices. At first, I thought it was the wind playing tricks on me. But then I heard my father's voice, low, trembling, angry. "You promised me, Lila. You promised it was over." My heart stopped. I had never heard him speak to her like that, not once in all my 16 years. Then came my mother's voice, quiet but firm. "It was over." I swear it was. "You don't understand what it cost me." "Cost you?" He snapped. "Do you have any idea what it cost me? To raise a child not knowing if she'd." Silence. A heavy, unbearable silence that pressed against my chest. I leaned closer to the door, my hand trembling against the wood. My breath caught in my throat. "If she what?" My father's voice broke. "You should have told me the truth. You should have told me she might not be mine." The world stopped spinning. For a long moment, I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The words hung in the air like thunder. She might not be mine. They were talking about me. I felt my knees weaken. I wanted to step away, to run, but my feet were rooted to the floor. My mother's voice came again, shaking but filled with sorrow. "I didn't know, Kareem. I didn't know for sure. It was one mistake, one moment of weakness before we were married. I thought he was gone forever. I tried to forget." "You hid it from me for 16 years, my father said bitterly. 16 years, Lila. Every time I looked at her, every time I loved her, you let me believe a lie." His voice cracked on the word love. I pressed a hand to my mouth, trying not to cry out. My body felt like it was burning from the inside out. The floor seemed to tilt beneath me. "I was protecting you both," my mother whispered. "I couldn't destroy this family. I thought if I buried it deep enough, it would stay buried." "Buried?" He said bitterly. "The truth doesn't stay buried, Lila. It just rots until it poisons everything." I heard something fall. Maybe a chair. Maybe his hand slamming against the table. Then footsteps. Heavy, uneven. The door creaked open. I jumped back, heart racing, slipping into the shadows of the hallway just in time. My father came out, his face pale, eyes wild with pain. He didn't see me. He walked past me and down the corridor, out into the rain without an umbrella. The door slammed behind him, and the sound echoed through the house like thunder. I turned back toward the bedroom door. It was still half open. Through the crack, I saw my mother sitting on the bed, her hands covering her face. The quilt, that old, beautiful quilt, had fallen to the floor. I wanted to run to her, to ask her what she meant, to beg her to say it wasn't true. But I couldn't move, because a part of me already knew. I thought back to the letters, the secret name I'd once heard her whisper in her sleep, the sadness that had lived behind her eyes for years. All the threads I hadn't understood began to weave themselves into a picture I wished I'd never seen. That night, I sat alone in my room until the candle melted to nothing. The rain outside turned into a steady whisper, like the world itself was trying to console me. But it didn't help. I felt like I had lost both of my parents in a single night, one to betrayal and one to guilt. When the dawn came, the house was silent. My father hadn't returned. My mother's door was still closed. I made tea, poured 2 cups, and set one on the table beside her door, like I always did. But she didn't open it. Hours passed before I finally pushed it open myself. She was still sitting in the same place, the quilt draped over her lap, eyes red but calm. When she looked up at me, I saw the exhaustion of a lifetime in her face. "You heard, didn't you?" she whispered. I couldn't speak. I just stood there, frozen. "Mariam," she said softly, "you mustn't hate me, please." My lips parted, but the words wouldn't come. My throat felt tight, my heart even tighter. "I thought I could protect you," she went on. "I thought if I loved you enough, it would make no difference whose blood you carried. But now everything's fallen apart." I finally found my voice, weak and trembling. "Who was he?" Her eyes filled with tears. "A man I loved before your father. A man I thought was lost to the war. I was young, foolish. And when I learned I was carrying you, he was gone. Then your father came, kind, gentle, willing to give me a future. I told myself that love could erase the past." She looked away, her fingers gripping the edge of the quilt. "But the past has a way of finding you, doesn't it?" I wanted to hate her in that moment. I wanted to scream, to tell her she had ruined everything. But when I looked at her, small, trembling, broken, all I felt was grief. Because I understood something she didn't say out loud. She had lived her whole life trying to love to people in silence. That night, I cried harder than I ever had before. I cried for my father, wandering somewhere in the rain. I cried for my mother, trapped in her guilt. And I cried for myself, the girl who suddenly didn't know who she was anymore. Days turned into weeks. My father didn't come home for a long time. When he finally did, he didn't speak a word. Not to her, not to me. He moved into the guest room, his laughter gone, his warmth gone. And my mother, she faded quietly. She'd sit by the window with the quilt across her knees, staring into nothing. She spoke less each day, as if the truth had drained the last of her strength. Once, I asked her why she'd never burned the quilt, why she kept something that only reminded her of pain. She smiled sadly. "Because not all love is meant to be forgotten," she said. "Even the kind that breaks you." Those words stayed with me. I didn't understand them fully then. But years later, when I unfolded that same quilt and found what she'd hidden inside it, I finally did. They say silence can heal. But I learned that silence can also harden. In the weeks after that night, my words dried up like the wells in our village after a long drought. I stopped asking questions. I stopped trying to understand. I simply watched. Watched my mother fold herself smaller every day. Watched my father disappear into his own bitterness. Watched our home lose the rhythm that once made it feel alive. I wasn't angry at first. I was numb. The truth had cut too deep to bleed right away. I'd wake up in the mornings to the sound of my mother coughing, her voice thin and distant, the smell of breakfast used to fill the house. Now, the air was empty. My father barely touched his food. Sometimes he would stare at me across the table, not cruelly, not coldly, but like he was searching for something familiar and couldn't find it. It hurt in ways I couldn't explain. Every glance from him was a question I didn't know how to answer. I remembered the day he moved out. He packed his things in silence, refusing to meet my mother's eyes. She sat on the edge of the bed, wringing her hands, whispering prayers under her breath. I stood by the door, watching him fold his shirts, one after another, with such precision it broke my heart. When he reached the doorway, he looked at me and said quietly, "You take care of her, Maryam. She's still your mother, still your mother." Those words felt heavier than all his silence combined. And then he left. Just like that, half of my home walked out into the world and never truly came back. The years that followed felt endless. I stayed with my mother, not out of forgiveness, I wasn't there yet, but because I couldn't leave her alone with her ghosts. Her health continued to decline, and soon she was too weak to leave the bed. The doctors said her heart was failing, but I knew it wasn't her heart that had given up. It was her spirit. I took care of her as best I could. I cooked her meals, cleaned her room, and read to her when she couldn't sleep. Sometimes she'd hold my hand and whisper, "One day, you'll understand why I did what I did." But I already understood, and that was the worst part. She hadn't betrayed us because she wanted to hurt anyone. She had done it because she couldn't bear to lose love, even if that love was built on lies. Still, my forgiveness didn't come easily. I carried my silence like armor. When she tried to speak of the past, I would nod but never answer. When she asked if I hated her, I would look away. I didn't have the heart to say no, and I couldn't bring myself to say yes. And yet, inside that silence, something began to grow, something colder than anger, sharper than grief. It wasn't revenge in the way people imagine it. I didn't want to destroy or punish. I wanted truth. If my mother had buried the truth once, I would be the one to unearth it. So I began to observe. Quietly, carefully, I started by revisiting her letters. After she passed away, just 3 months after my father left, I went through her old drawers, her sewing chest, her diary, everything. But she had been meticulous. Every letter was gone, burned, most likely, like the one I'd seen her tear apart that stormy night. All that remained was the quilt, that old, worn quilt that she had guarded like it held her soul. I couldn't bring myself to open it then. It still smelled like her, rosewater, smoke, and something faintly sweet. So I folded it and kept it at the foot of my bed, untouched. For years, my father never remarried, but he never returned either. He sent money sometimes, a few lines on postcards written in the same stiff handwriting. "Hope you are well. Stay strong." I would stare at those words, wondering if he wrote them for me or for himself. Time moved on, as it always does. I finished school, started working at the local clinic, and built a quiet life for myself. Outwardly, I was calm, kind, polite, helpful, the kind of girl people trusted with their secrets. But inside, I was still a storm. Every time I saw a happy family, I thought of my mother's hidden letters. Every time I heard laughter between parents and children, I wondered how it must feel to live without doubt hanging over you. And yet, I didn't let my bitterness spill out. I swallowed it. I let it settle deep in me, heavy and unmoving. That was my revenge, my silence. Because silence can be a mirror, and I wanted both my parents, wherever they were, to look into that mirror and see what their choices had done. I remember one Sunday, about 3 years after my mother's passing. My father came to visit. It was unexpected. He hadn't written ahead, hadn't even sent word. I opened the door to find him standing there, older, thinner, a sadness carved into the lines of his face. "You look like her," he said softly. I didn't know whether to take it as a compliment or a curse. We sat in the living room, the air thick with everything unsaid. His eyes wandered around the room until they stopped on the quilt draped over my chair. "She never let that thing go," he murmured. I waited, expecting him to say more, but he didn't. Finally, I asked, "Did you ever forgive her?" He didn't answer right away. He stared at his hands for a long time before saying, "Forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting, Mariam. Some wounds don't close, you just learn to live around them." Then he looked at me, eyes glistening. "But you don't carry what we did. Don't let our sins shape your life." I nodded politely, but inside, I was already shaped by them. Years passed. I married a kind man who loved me gently and without questions. We built a small life together, quiet, steady, good. Yet, even in my happiest moments, a part of me remained untouched. When my children asked about their grandmother, I told them only the good things. How she baked the softest bread. How she could mend anything from a torn dress to a broken heart. I never told them about the nights I spent listening to her whisper to ghosts. But sometimes, when the house was quiet and the moonlight slipped through the curtains, I'd find myself sitting beside the quilt again. My fingers would trace the faded stitching, the uneven patterns, the hidden layers. There was something about it that still called to me, a whisper of unfinished truth. It took me more than 20 years to finally listen. One afternoon, while cleaning the attic, I unfolded the quilt fully for the first time since she died. It was older, frayed around the edges, the colors faded like old memories. As I ran my hands along the fabric, something caught my nail, a small, hard knot beneath one of the seams. For a moment, I froze. Then, slowly, I tugged at the loose thread. The stitching came undone, thread by thread, until a small piece of folded paper slipped out and fell onto the floor. My heart pounded in my chest. The paper was yellowed, fragile with age. I unfolded it carefully, and there it was. Her handwriting. The truth she had carried. The one she could never speak. The one she had sewn into the very fabric of her life. In that moment, all my years of silence led to this. The revenge I had carried, my stillness, my restraint, had brought me to the truth she tried to bury. As I read that letter, my hands trembled, and the world blurred through my tears. It wasn't a confession of guilt. It was a plea for forgiveness, a story of love and fear, of mistakes made and lives crossed. It told me who my real father was, yes, but it also told me who she had been before the guilt, before the lies. A young woman in love, scared, desperate, and alone in a world that didn't forgive easily. When I finished reading, I pressed the letter against my heart and wept, not for the betrayal anymore, but for the years we had both wasted in silence. That was my revenge. Not rage, not shame, but finally, understanding. Because in the end, my silence had outlasted the pain. It had carried me to the truth, the one my mother had tried to hide, yet also wanted me to find when I was ready. The storm came without warning that afternoon. I had been dusting the old shelves, trying to pass another lonely day, when thunder rolled across the valley and the windows rattled in their frames. The sky, dark as slate, pressed close to the roof, and the air carried that damp, restless smell that always reminded me of my mother's tears. I don't know what led me to the attic. Maybe the wind, maybe memory, or maybe, after all these years, something inside me finally decided it was time. The quilt lay in its usual place, folded neatly in the cedar chest, untouched for decades. Its colors had faded into soft whispers: pale rose, smoke gray, a deep maroon that looked almost black in the dim light. I lifted it out carefully, my fingers tracing the seams like reading a map of a life once hidden from me. And then I saw it, a small, uneven patch near the corner, where the stitches didn't quite align. Something in my chest stirred. The thunder cracked again, sharp and close, as I fetched a pair of scissors. The room flickered with lightning, throwing shadows across the walls like ghosts waking up. I hesitated, just for a moment, then slid the scissors beneath the loose thread. The fabric gave with a faint snip, and something small and hard slipped out from the seam, landing on the wooden floor with a soft tap. It was an envelope, yellowed with time, sealed, but not tightly, as if it had waited for me, patiently, through the years. I picked it up, trembling. My name was written on the front in my mother's familiar looping script, for Mariam. When you are ready. My knees gave out. I sat on the floor, the quilt spread around me like a shroud. The sound of rain drummed on the roof, steady, rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. For years, I had imagined what truth she might have hidden. I had prepared myself for pain, for betrayal, for the kind of secret that could split a family apart. But in that moment, with the envelope in my hands, all I felt was fear. Not fear of what I would learn, but fear of what it would make me remember. Still, I tore the seal open. Inside were 3 pages, folded carefully, written in her trembling handwriting, the same hand that once brushed my hair behind my ears, that once stitched every torn hem of my childhood dresses. And then, slowly, I began to read. My dearest Mariam, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have found the truth I could not speak. I tried many times to tell you, but every time I saw your eyes, your father's eyes, I lost my courage. You were born out of love, not sin, but it was a love the world would never have allowed me to keep. I stopped breathing. The words swam before my eyes. The room tilted, and I had to hold onto the quilt just to stay upright. She continued, when I was your age, I was engaged to your father, Rahim. He was kind, steady, everything my family wanted for me. But before the wedding, I met another man, a writer, who came to our town to document the floods that year. His name was Yusuf. He was wild and gentle at the same time. He saw me, not as someone's daughter, not as someone's fiancée, but as myself. He listened to me, to my dreams. He taught me to read poetry, to question, to feel. I tried to stay away, but love is a stubborn thing. It finds you even when you run from it. We spent one night together before he left. One night that changed my life, and yours. The candle beside me flickered violently. I pressed a hand to my chest, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. When I found out I was pregnant, I thought my life was over. My family would have disowned me. Your father, Rahim, would have turned his love into shame. So I lied. I told him you were his. And he, bless his heart, believed me. He loved you, Mariam. Truly, that love was real as the guilt that followed me every day after. I burned Yusuf's letters. I buried the truth under smiles and silence. But silence is a cruel thing. It rots you from the inside. My tears blurred the ink. But I kept reading. When Rahim found out, years later, it wasn't because I confessed. He found one of Yusuf's old letters I had forgotten to burn. He didn't shout. He didn't curse me. He just looked at me with those quiet, shattered eyes and said, I thought we had everything. He left that night, and I never saw him again. I wanted to tell you the truth before I died, but how could I? I had already stolen your peace once. I couldn't take your father's love away from you too. I stopped reading then, pressing the paper to my face, breathing in the faint scent of old ink and rosewater, the same scent that had haunted me since I was a girl. The rain outside had grown heavier now, battering the roof like fists against a coffin. It felt as though the storm had been waiting for this moment, for this unveiling. I looked at the last page. Her words wavered, the handwriting weaker, unsteady. If you ever find this letter, I hope you will understand that I was not trying to deceive you. I was trying to protect you from the cruelty of people, from their judgment, from the pain of being called unwanted. You were wanted, Miriam. Every breath of yours was wanted. You were my greatest sin and my greatest salvation. I could not tell you while I lived, but I pray that when you read this, you will forgive me, not for what I did, but for what I was too afraid to do. Your mother, Nayla. The final word blurred under my tears. Forgive me. For years, I had wanted to ask her why. Now I had the answer, and it burned. I pressed the pages to my chest and rocked back and forth as the storm raged on outside. I wasn't angry anymore, not at her, not even at him. But I was broken all over again. My whole life had been built around silence. Her silence, my father's silence, and finally my own. We had all been prisoners of it. I thought of Yusuf, a name I had never known until now. A man who existed only in my mother's trembling script. Somewhere out there, perhaps he had wondered about me. Or perhaps he never knew. I thought of Rahim, the man who raised me, who left without hate, but with a heart too heavy to heal. And I thought of my mother, sewing her guilt into a quilt, hiding her truth beneath the stitches of fabric and love, hoping one day I would find it when I was strong enough to bear it. She had been right. I wasn't ready then, but I was ready now. I lit a candle and placed it beside her photograph on the table. The rain softened into a gentle patter, and the thunder rolled away into silence. I took a deep breath and spoke aloud, perhaps to her spirit, perhaps to the walls that had heard everything we could not say. I forgive you, Amma, for everything, for hiding it, for carrying it alone. You were trying to protect me, and in your own way, you did. My voice trembled, but it didn't break. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed awake reading the letter over and over until I could recite it by heart. Each time, the pain lessened just a little, and the understanding grew deeper. By dawn, the storm had passed. The light fell across the quilt, warm and golden, washing the years of sorrow out of its colors. I folded the letter and slipped it back under the seam, not to hide it, but to keep it safe. It no longer felt like a secret. It felt like peace. Then I whispered softly, "The truth lies now. It's safe." And for the first time in decades, I felt free. That letter didn't just give me the truth. It gave me back my mother, the woman behind the guilt, the human beneath the mistakes. I understood then that revenge was never about hurting anyone. It was about reclaiming what silence had stolen. My right to know, to understand, to forgive. Her letter was the final key. And when I found it, I didn't just unlock the past. I unlocked myself. The sun rose quiet the next morning, pale, hesitant, like it, too, was unsure how to shine after such a storm. The house felt different, though nothing had changed. The same old clock ticked in the hallway, the same floorboards creaked under my feet, but the air itself felt lighter. Maybe it was me. Maybe, after all these years, I had finally let something go. I sat by the window, holding a cup of tea that had long gone cold, and looked at the quilt lying folded neatly on the table. It didn't scare me anymore. It used to, not the fabric, but what it represented, all those untold things stitched into silence. Now, it looked softer. Sad, yes, but no longer accusing. Like a confession that had finally been spoken. I thought about my mother all day. Every word of her letter echoed through me, not as a wound anymore, but as a heartbeat. She had carried her truth alone, not because she didn't trust me, but because she feared breaking what little happiness we had left. How lonely she must have been. How heavy that silence must have felt. I remembered her sitting by the window when I was a little girl, staring out at nothing for long stretches of time. Back then, I thought she was just tired. But now I knew she wasn't tired. She was remembering. She was sitting with Ghost. And for all those years, I'd misunderstood her silence as distance. It was never distance. It was love, the kind that hurts too much to speak out by noon. I found myself standing by the cedar chest again. I opened it, not with trembling hands this time, but with calm acceptance. I took the letter out and read it once more, slower now, line by line. Every sentence that had once pierced me now soothed me instead. Her pain was mine, yes, but so was her courage. She had loved deeply, made mistakes, paid for them every day, and still found a way to raise me with tenderness. And my father, Rahim, the man I thought had left out of anger. Now I saw him differently. All these years, I had blamed him for walking away, for leaving her, for leaving me. But perhaps he hadn't left in hatred. Perhaps he had left because forgiveness, then, was too heavy to carry. He had loved us both, even if the truth broke that love in two. People always talk about betrayal as a cruel act, a tearing apart. But I learned that sometimes betrayal grows out of fear, not malice. My mother hadn't wanted to hurt anyone. She just wanted to survive the judgment of her world. And my father, he hadn't wanted revenge. He just couldn't live with what he knew. Between them stood me, a child of love and silence. That night, I couldn't sleep. I went outside instead. The rain had washed the garden clean, and the smell of wet soil filled the air. I looked up at the stars, faint but steady, and for the first time, I spoke to them like I was speaking to her. "Emma," I whispered, "I understand now. You were scared. You were human. And you loved me in the only way you knew how." The wind moved through the trees softly, like a sigh. Maybe it was just the night breeze, or maybe, in some way I'll never be able to explain, she was answering me. In the days that followed, I started seeing everything through new eyes. I went through old albums, touching her face in each faded photograph. There she was, smiling at my wedding, holding my first child, standing by the garden she loved. And beneath every picture, I could almost feel the heartbeat of her unspoken story. It wasn't anger that filled me now. It was compassion. How many women had lived like her? How many had buried their truth under quilts, diaries, smiles, or silence, just to protect someone else? I realized something then. My mother's story wasn't just hers. It was the story of so many women who had been taught to hide, to endure, to carry love like a secret sin. And maybe, by reading her letter, I had inherited not her shame, but her strength. A week later, my granddaughter Aisha came to visit. She was only 20, full of questions and laughter and dreams. She sat by me as I stitched the torn corner of the quilt back together. "Dottie," she asked curiously, "why do you still keep this old thing? It's falling apart." I smiled and looked at her, really looked at her. Her eyes were bright, fearless, full of the kind of courage my mother never had the chance to live. "This quilt," I said softly, "was made by your great-grandmother. Every piece of it tells a story of love, loss, mistakes, and forgiveness." She tilted her head, intrigued. "Forgiveness? Yes, my child. Sometimes, the heaviest thing we carry isn't anger. It's silence. And when you finally speak the truth, even if it hurts, that's when you begin to live free." She nodded, though I could see she didn't quite understand yet. But one day she would. We all do, when life teaches us. I decided then that I would tell her the full story one day. Not now, not when she was still seeing the world as soft and kind, but someday, when she needed to know that truth and love can exist in the same breath at night. I took the letter one last time. I unfolded it carefully, read the final line, and whispered the words aloud. You were my greatest sin and my greatest salvation. I smiled through my tears. Emma, I saw .id softly. You were my greatest lesson. I placed the letter inside a small wooden box and locked it, tying the key to the quilt with a ribbon. Not to hide it this time, but to preserve it. The next generations should know where they came from, even if the truth is messy. As the night deepened, I sat by the window again, the same way my mother used to. I watched the moonlight touch the quilt, the soft folds glowing like something holy. I realized that truth, no matter how painful, doesn't destroy you. It frees you. For decades, I had carried the weight of something I didn't even understand. Now, I carried only the understanding itself, and it was lighter than air. I thought of all the choices my mother had made, of how easily we judge others without knowing what storms they've survived in silence. She wasn't perfect. Neither was I, but maybe perfection was never the point. Maybe love was, even when it came wrapped in mistakes. When the clock struck midnight, I whispered one last prayer, not for forgiveness this time, but for peace. May every woman who hides her truth find the courage to speak it. May every heart broken by betrayal find the grace to heal. And may silence, one day, no longer be mistaken for strength. The wind rustled the curtains, soft and cool against my face. I closed my eyes and smiled, feeling her presence beside me, not as guilt anymore, but as love. The truth had hurt me, but it had also set me free. And as I drifted to sleep that night, I realized I wasn't just my mother's daughter anymore. I was her continuation. Her story lived through me, but now it had an ending, a peaceful one. It has been many months since I found my mother's letter. The seasons have turned again, spring to summer, summer to the quiet chill of autumn, and the house feels different now, lighter, softer, as if the walls themselves have exhaled the secret they kept for too long. I still wake up early each morning. Old habits die hard. I make my tea, open the curtains, and let the pale light spill across the room. The quilt lies on my bed now, not folded away in the chest. I spread it out every night before I sleep, and every time my hands trace its faded fabric, I feel her there, my mother, not as a ghost anymore, but as peace. There are stains on that quilt, faint brownish marks where the threads are worn. For years, I thought they were tea spills or the accidents of time. But now I know better. They are tears. Hers, maybe, or mine, or both. Once, those stains filled me with sorrow. Now, they remind me of the strength it takes to cry quietly and still carry on. I've stopped trying to hide them. You see, the older I've grown, the more I've learned. Not everything broken needs to be mended. Some things need only to be accepted. That quilt, with all its flaws and fading colors, is the truest thing I own. Forgiveness. People think it means forgetting, but I've learned that forgetting is easy. It's what cowards do when the truth is too heavy to hold. Forgiveness is harder. Forgiveness is waking up every morning and deciding not to carry yesterday's pain into today. It's choosing to remember, but without the bitterness. It took me a lifetime to understand that. I used to think my silence was strength. That holding in my pain made me wise, dignified, even brave. But silence is not strength, my dear. Silence is survival. And survival is only half of living. The other half, the better half, is truth. When I found my mother's letter, it tore open everything I had sealed away. But it also gave me something precious, the permission to speak. And now I do. Sometimes, when my granddaughter visits, I tell her stories from my youth, the innocent ones first. How her grandfather and I met at the harvest fair. How her great-grandmother could make a whole meal out of leftovers in love. And then, when the night grows quiet and the clock ticks softly, I tell her the harder ones. About secrets, about mistakes, about how love is never as simple as we wish it to be. I tell her that truth may hurt, but it's the only thing that lets your heart breathe. That forgiveness doesn't mean excusing what was done. It means refusing to let it define you anymore. She listens with her head on my shoulder, her hand wrapped around mine, and I see in her eyes something I never saw in my own youth, courage born from understanding, not fear. That's when I know my mother's story wasn't wasted. It traveled through pain and silence to reach the one person who could tell it without shame, me. And now it will live on through her. I think of my mother often these days. Sometimes I see her in my dreams, sitting on the veranda, sewing the quilt under the afternoon sun. Her face is calm, her hands steady. She doesn't look burdened anymore. In my dream, I sit beside her. She looks at me, and for the first time, she smiles. Not the tight, careful smile I remember from my childhood, but something warmer. And she says, "You found it, didn't you?" I nod. "Yes, Emma, I did." She reaches out, touches my cheek, and says, "Then you've done what I couldn't." I wake up every time with tears on my face, not from sadness, but from peace. Maybe heaven is in some faraway place. Maybe it's just the moment you finally understand the people who hurt you. On quiet evenings, I sit by the window, my tea cooling beside me, the quilt draped across my knees. The sky turns gold, then violet, then that deep shade of blue that always makes me think of endings. That's when I whisper a prayer, not for myself, but for those still living in silence. May your truths find their voices, I say softly. May your hearts forgive before time runs out. You see, we all have a quilt of our own, stitched from the pieces of our past, our mistakes, our love, our guilt. Some patches are bright, others are dark, but together, they make something beautiful, because they tell our story. My mother's quilt taught me that even the most painful truths can be softened by time. That every stitch, no matter how crooked, was made by hands trying their best. And maybe that's all any of us are doing, trying our best, even when it's messy, even when it's not enough. Sometimes, I still hear the rain tapping against the roof, like that day in the attic. But now, it doesn't sound like mourning. It sounds like music, gentle, forgiving, endless. I close my eyes and remember the words she wrote, "You were my greatest sin and my greatest salvation." And I whisper back, "You were my greatest pain and my greatest peace." That's what forgiveness feels like, not joy, not sorrow, but the quiet balance of both. If I've learned anything in this long, winding life, it's this: truth is not always kind, but it's always necessary. And forgiveness is not something you give once. It's something you choose every day. When I was young, I wanted revenge for every hurt I couldn't name. Now, I only want understanding. Because revenge ends stories.